Great. Okay, so thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Dara Shaw. I'm a project manager who is leading the consultant team that is supporting the Department of Planning and Development with the Calumet Area Land Use Plan and Design Guidelines update. Once again, thank you so much for being here today. Our goal for our conversation today is to discuss what the Calumet Area Land Use Plan is, share some of the draft plan vision, draft goals, and draft objectives, also share the draft land use framework, and discuss what comes next and how we are looking to get feedback from the community. Okay, so let's start with what is the Calumet Area Land Use Plan? So our plan overview, essentially this plan and design guidelines is seeking to establish a 10 to 20-year vision for the Calumet and Burnside and Pullman industrial corridors, along with additional industrial areas that are adjacent to these corridors. So the components of the plan include vision, goals, and objectives, a land use framework, implementation strategies, and design guidelines. And we'll talk through our timeline in just a second, but today's focus of our webinar today is to introduce the draft, vision, goals, and objectives for feedback, and also the land use framework. The implementation strategies and design guidelines will be developed later on in fall and winter. All right. And so, like I said, I'm from Youth Community Design. My name is Dara, and we are leading the consultant team that is supporting the Department of Planning and Development. Luke, do you want to introduce yourself now before we go into your slides?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dara. Hi, everybody. Luke Mish, planner and project manager here at the Chicago Department of Planning and Development. I work in our citywide planning bureau, our systems planning division, and we are leading this work overall here in Calumet. We are working very closely with others here at DPD, including the team at the Far South planning region, Erica Selke, Jasmine Gunn, and Tamara Fu. Um, and I'll just say that we are tackling industrial corridor planning citywide at the moment, looking at other corridors as well. So excited to be doing this work and excited to be talking to you all about it today.
Thanks, Luke. So, on our consultant team that is supporting DPD or Department of Planning and Development is SB Friedman, who is helping us with the market analysis aspect of the work, Red Resources to support with community engagement, along with Muse, Lamar Johnson Collaborative that is leading the design guidelines, and Site Urban Design, which is also supporting the design guidelines aspect. We also wanted to share a big thank you to our planning partners. So there is the Calumet Area Industrial Commission, which is the local, we call it Leary, that's jargon, so I won't use the jargon, but local industrial retention initiative. Luke, did I get that right? Awesome, great. So our Leary Local Industrial Retention Initiative that works with the city of Chicago to support industrial businesses, and CAIC specifically supports the Calumet area and additional areas as well. And then Calumet Connect, which is a partnership of several different organizations that have been working for decades in the community, supporting quality of life initiatives and environmental work as well. And we, of course, thank our alder people and the ward offices. So we have the 7th Ward, 8th Ward, 9th Ward, and 10th Ward in our study boundary. So we've been grateful to partner with some great alder people as well. And we have a robust working group for this planning initiative that is composed of industrial businesses, Calumet area residents, different community organizations, civic organizations, and governmental partners supporting this process as well. So for those of you that are on this page and in the webinar today, thank you so much for your continued support with this effort. A little bit more about our schedule. So we are in phase 2, which is the development of the draft land use framework, and draft is the operative here. So we want your feedback on everything we're going to be sharing today, and we'll share a little bit more about how to give that feedback in a second. We did have an open house in person that was in July 24th, the day that it was rainy and stormy, but some people came out and we had a really great time. So we also wanted to capture feedback via virtually on the webinar for people who are not necessarily able to make it in person. So after our draft land use framework, we're going to be in a period of community engagement to be able to get additional feedback on the proposed draft land use framework. And then we'll move into phase 3, which is to refine the land use framework from the feedback that we got and also work on the design guidelines. Okay, and so our goals for today are to share the progress of the planning process, share the draft of the future land use framework and principles that are guiding the framework, and also to answer your questions on the draft vision, goals, and future land uses themselves. And so one way that we can interact in this webinar today is to submit questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom. So if you scroll to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. If you click on that button, let's go back. Not that direction, the other direction. Okay, there we go. So if you click on that Q&A button, you should be able to submit a question. We are going to try to answer as many questions that we can on the webinar today, understanding that we might not be able to address all of them. If not, we'll be able to include them in our meeting recap, which will be posted to the website as well. All right, and with that, I will pass it back to Luke, who will walk us through the draft vision and goals for the plan.
Thanks, Dara. Yeah, if we can jump to the next slide, I'll dive in. So, as this plan unfolds overall, we start with this idea of a vision statement. And so at the moment, the current draft, as you see on the screen, is building on the region's industrial legacy, natural assets, and dynamic culture. The Calumet area will sustain a thriving and innovative economy, promote sustainability and environmental stewardship, and support safe and healthy neighborhoods centered around the Calumet River. So as Dara mentioned in the intro, the focus of this plan is really the three industrial corridors that surround Lake Calumet. That's the Calumet, the Burnside, and the Pullman industrial corridors. And then we're also looking at additional properties that are outside of those corridor boundaries, but are either industrial in nature themselves or previously industrially zoned. So really focusing on industrial areas in Calumet and what the appropriate future land uses are for those. With that in mind, this vision statement, we think captures, what we're trying to achieve as part of this plan and has incorporated a lot of the thinking that we've already heard from engagement that we've done to date. But as a note, it's a draft. So we are, very much still working to make sure that this vision is meeting the needs of the plan as the process continues. And then if we can go to the next slide, I'll do an overview. So the goals for the plan, which support the vision, are really intended as kind of high-level outcomes of this plan. These again are draft. This is probably the third or fourth iteration of these that we've taken on. As Dara mentioned, we've been meeting with a working group of engaged parties monthly for the last 6 or 7 months. And through discussions with that group, these goals have changed over time. I'll also note that each of the goals has objectives that live underneath. Those objectives help to flesh out, the intention of the goal and maybe start to point at specific strategies. In the interest of time in today's presentation, we don't have those objectives on the screen, but when we post this material online, you'll be able to see those as well. And we do want, to make sure folks are thinking through that. So just to read through these quickly, goal 1, invest in Calumet as a hub for jobs and economic activity. That is critical looking at our industrial corridors. That is really the purpose of Chicago's industrial corridors, is to serve as vital job centers and really engines of economic activity. And so the three corridors in Calumet are no different. And so that continues to be a major goal. Goal 2, protect and enhance Calumet's natural resources and open spaces. Again, that's true as we look at industrial and other areas across the city, but we really have a lot of unique and specific environmental assets here in the Calumet area. between the extensive wetlands, the Calumet River, Lake Calumet, and the host of flora and fauna that call all of those home. And so we recognize that, while again, goal number one is critical for us, so is goal number two, making sure that we're protecting those resources and the open spaces that allow, habitat to thrive, but also allow folks to engage with nature and with recreation. Um, Goal three, enhance infrastructure to improve mobility, safety, and sustainability. Generally, as we look at land use plans here at the Department of Planning and Development, we tend to focus really on the properties themselves. So what is the appropriate future land use for those properties? But inherent in looking at things like that, we need to make sure that we're also thinking about how people get to those properties, how goods move across this area, and how other infrastructure like utilities are or are not serving the needs of an area. So, this is not a transportation-based plan per se, but we are definitely thinking about mobility, safety, sustainability as it relates to the infrastructural kind of networks in Calumet. Goal four, support the health and well-being of Calumet's communities. Again, our geographic focus for this study uh, is really the industrial areas in Calumet. But of course, surrounding those industrial areas are many neighborhoods. And so as we think about making sure we maintain Calumet as a hub for jobs and economic activity, we look at the natural resources and open spaces, and we think of infrastructure. We also want to make sure that we are ensuring a healthy and vibrant neighborhoods and communities are able to thrive surrounding this area. And then finally, goal five, bolster regional culture, identity, and collaboration. A rich history in Calumet, and even saying that is a bit of a blurring the lines a bit, right? That Calumet is a large region, and each neighborhood, each community area has its own history. That history is based in the natural resources of the area and how the area developed over time. It also is based in the industrial heritage and history of the area, from the steel mills and onward. And of course, it includes the you know cultural elements that really drive the area. Of course, we've got the Pullman National Monument within this area, but we also have the more day-to-day kind of cultural elements of the neighborhood surrounding here. So that is also top of mind for us and part of the kind of broader goals here for the plan. We can go to the next slide. So that kind of covers the high level guiding elements of the plan, right? The vision states where we're trying to go. The goals talk a little bit more in detail of some of the specific topics that we want to make sure we're covering. But in addition to that, the draft land use framework is an incredibly important part of the plan. It's really the core of the plan. That framework is really what sets up understanding what appropriate future land uses are. And I'll pause before jumping into what you see on the screen here to just say that the way these land use plans tend to work is we try to establish what the appropriate future land use is moving forward. And what that means is that the plan, once it's fully drafted, will identify the kinds of uses that are appropriate in different areas of our study boundary. Uh, those will come to fruition when sites within those areas are redeveloped or developed for the first time if they've been vacant for a while. So what that means is the land use plan is really future looking. It's establishing, what we want to see when properties redevelop, but it does take, in most cases, it does take that action of private redevelopment of those properties to realize the vision and the goals of the plan. So, how did this draft land use framework, and again, draft is critical to what we're talking about here. How did this draft land use framework come to be? As I mentioned, we've been meeting with our great working group since the very end of last year. And over those monthly meetings, we've talked about a number of topics. So we've talked about the economy and workforce in the Calumet area. We've looked at market conditions and trends. We've understood what existing land uses are, where those land uses are, you know, likely to stay the same over the next 10 to 20 years, and where there might be opportunities for things to shift. We've talked about how job density and wages vary not only across the geography, but across different sectors of industrial and commercial uses. We looked at nature and ecology as a topic, right? So we looked to understand where the existing open spaces are and where there might be opportunities for expansion. We looked at access to existing open spaces and to the edge of the Calumet River. The Calumet River is, of course, an active working river, but which makes accessing the water itself oftentimes not really appropriate. But certainly opportunities to access the edge of that river and enjoy the asset that it is something we've been looking at. And we also looked at edge conditions of those open spaces. Transportation and infrastructure, I mentioned, that is not a really core focus of this plan, but it is important to understand how land uses do and don't work, right? And which land uses are supported by the current transportation network and which maybe are not. And so we looked at those existing networks. We're working closely with CDOT, CTA, Metra, the Cook County Department of Transportation and Highways to understand what projects are coming online and how changes to the network may make different kinds of development available in the future. And then finally, we looked at health and community as well, both thinking about the cumulative impact assessment and environmental justice neighborhoods and the work that's been done coming out of the cumulative impact assessments, but also looking more broadly at pollution risk, code violations, and some strategies for addressing public health as part of this plan. Let me go to the next slide. So as we looked at all of those topics, a few key considerations kind of came to the front. Number one was where are there different kinds of industrial development today? Where are those uses likely to stay the same over the next 10 to 20 years? And where are areas where we might see changes? And which kinds of, specifically what kinds of industrial are where today, right? Where do we see manufacturing versus where we see warehousing versus where we see waste processing or recycling? So we, try to get a lay of the land of that and understand where those uses are and what the future might hold for those uses. We also looked at land use conflicts and edge conditions. So where are there uses where, are there industrial uses directly adjacent to residential uses? Is that causing an issue? Are there commercial uses and open spaces that are near one another that might actually be a benefit, right? That open space near some of these uses may prove to be an asset. So looking at that and understanding how we can minimize conflicts and kind of maximize positive benefits. I mentioned we looked at the existing transportation network and previously proposed improvements and how that may or may not unlock certain development opportunities and access to existing open space assets. And then we looked at redevelopment and open space opportunities more specifically. So identifying where vacant properties are, especially large vacant properties in the area, those are, going to be probably the most likely to be redeveloped in the next 10 to 20 years. Not in all cases, but in many cases. And so, which of those properties are suited for development and which are more suited for open space was something that was critical to our thinking. We go to the next slide. So as we reviewed all of this information, we thought about those key considerations. What came to the fore were these draft land use framework principles. So these principles really helped guide not only which land uses are appropriate in different areas of the study boundary, but specifically how those uses interact with one another and how they interact with existing assets. So those principles, as currently established, are number one, reduce use intensity near neighborhoods to minimize conflicts. So the thinking here is that as the industrial corridors kind of give way to the neighborhoods that surround them, we want to find opportunities to reduce the future land use intensity along those edges, so that the kind of edges of the industrial corridor step down in the intensity of industrial use and are therefore more compatible with the kinds of neighborhood uses that surround these corridors. Principle number two was to preserve opportunities for new job-rich industrial development. So as we mentioned in the goal discussion and the vision discussion, the industrial corridors are really seen as critical locations for jobs in Chicago. And so still maintaining opportunities for new job-rich development was very much part of the thinking here. But as you'll note, we're trying to do that in a really strategic and thoughtful way to make sure that potential negative impacts from those kinds of uses are really minimized, especially for the surrounding neighborhoods. And really, what I'll mention on that as well is identifying where those existing infrastructural networks, uh, access to the river, access to rail yards, access to highways, where do those really set up well for industrial uses? That's where we want to prioritize industrial use, and areas that aren't really well connected to existing infrastructure, maybe long term are not appropriate for industry and are more appropriate for something else. Our third principle was to define specific areas for new heavy industrial uses to limit negative impacts. So, principle number one talks about kind of reducing intensity on the edges of the corridors. And so principle number three is about identifying, heavy industrial uses, and we'll get into this in a moment, but the kinds of uses that, may require river access to move raw materials, or that, maybe have more intensive kind of issues with odor or other things. Uh, those might be uses that are still appropriate broadly in the Calumet region, but they are not necessarily appropriate everywhere. So a major principle for us was finding where those places, where the locations were within the study boundary that were most appropriate for those, and really trying to limit heavy industrial to those locations. And then finally, we're looking at expanding the open space network and improving access to the river. I think we mentioned at the top of this call, this effort is really an update to the existing 2002 Calumet Area Land Use Plan. And that plan identified a number of new open spaces that could be created. Many of those have been realized. So places like Big Marsh or Indian Ridge Marsh did not exist as formal open spaces at the time of the 2002 land use plan. That land use plan called for those to be created. They were. Um, it also called for a number of other open spaces to be created that have not yet been realized. So as we've been looking at it here in 2024 and 2025, we are identifying a lot of the same locations because those are really sensible places for open space. So we are looking at expanding open space and making sure that some of that open space and other access opportunities are adjacent to the Calumet River. Let me go to the next slide. So what does all that result in? The land use framework is represented, the draft land use framework is represented by this map you see on the right. Those colors reflect broad land use categories that you see on the screen. So we've identified 5 kind of broad land use categories as we think of the next 10 to 20 years in Calumet, what is going to be appropriate in different locations. And we'll be stepping through each of these, but these 5 uses really exist on a spectrum from least intensive to most intensive, right? So open space and restoration, you think of as, having the least kind of potential impacts to surrounding neighbors. And then as we move through neighborhood mixed use, commercial and light industrial, moderate industrial, and heavy industrial, we get increasingly more kind of potential impacts to surrounding. And so we're, thinking about that as a spectrum as we look to locate these. And we can go to the next slide and we can jump into each of these individually. So open space and restoration, this kind of broad land use category is one that would include both public and privately managed restoration spaces, areas for conservation or recreation. So this could be anything from a nature area to a community park, but it could also include cultural resources. So things like the Pullman National Historical Park. And then finally, this is a category that would also include what we're calling buffers, so vegetated buffers. These might be properties you can kind of see some on the map to the right of the screen. Some of these really narrow, long but narrow stretches of land that are color coded green here maybe aren't appropriate for people to access to occupy. They might not be large enough for a ball field, or might not even be large enough for a trail or anything that would let you kind of occupy the space, but they might serve an important purpose of separating through vegetation industrial uses from other uses. And so the buffering aspect is considered part of this. So as we look to identify where these areas would go in the plan, we're prioritizing strengthening where existing parks and natural areas are, creating and connecting larger green corridors, and ensuring that ecological areas and parks and buffers are able to thrive. And these areas, would not be intended for kind of what we'd call vertical development, right? Buildings, major buildings, right? This would be, buildings that would support a park use, like a field house or something like that could be appropriate. But, this would not be where other forms of development would be appropriate. And we can go to the next slide. So neighborhood mixed use is that kind of next step up in terms of use category. These would be areas where kind of the broad range of neighborhood type uses would be appropriate. So that could be residential uses, single family home, two flats, multifamily. It could be commercial uses like retail, shopping, restaurants. It could be things like schools and libraries and other cultural or education uses. It could be things like healthcare. Um, as I mentioned, the focus of our study area is really the industrial uh, areas here in Calumet. So we don't have a ton of locations where these kinds of uses are appropriate. But as you can see, there are a handful here, either where those uses exist today and are appropriate to continue, or places where other uses might occupy the site today. But because of the context, it's really, these kinds of uses that are more appropriate long term. And so again, we're prioritizing areas near existing residential, institutional, or commercial uses, and discouraging things like industry. Let me go to the next slide. So our third category, commercial and light industrial, this kind of bridges between some of those neighborhood uses and some of the more industrial uses. So these would be areas where things on the more commercial side, like restaurants and retail, and so shopping and other kinds of office or commercial space would be appropriate, but so would some of the more limited industrial uses like fabrication studios, food and beverage production, breweries, um, or even things like contractor facilities, offices basically where building construction firms may be located. So these are, these are locations where, we wouldn't see residential uses as appropriate here, but we also wouldn't see really intensive industrial as appropriate. These are kind of that transition zone areas where there's visible street frontage and access to major streets, maybe nearby residential and other commercial uses. But yeah, again, trying to avoid those more intensive industrial uses. If we go to the next slide. Modern industrial then is kind of our next step up. And this is a category that would include really a broad range of existing industrial uses. And you can see from the map, this really captures a lot of the Calumet area. This captures a lot of the existing industrial businesses that are located here. And for the most part, a lot of within the industrial corridor boundary. So here we would see things like manufacturing and processing. Again, some of the images you see on the screen. So Ford, Naylor Pipe up in Burnside, Method Manufacturing in Pullman, also warehouse and distribution uses, and other kind of industrial service uses. These are, the goal is to prioritize job-rich industries, and these are located in areas that have easy access to either the river or rail or highway infrastructure, because those are needed to move the goods that are really produced at these locations. So again, this is a broad range of industrial uses, but we are again looking to really exclude those heaviest uses from these areas, or rather, I should say, the heaviest uses, heavy kinds of industrial uses are just not appropriate in these areas long term. And I would also say, of course, the other end of the spectrum is also not appropriate. These are not areas where residential or many of the kind of more neighborhood commercial uses would be appropriate. And then finally, we do have the heavy industrial use category. So this category would allow for the same kinds of uses that are in the moderate category. So, you know, uh, general kind of manufacturing or warehousing would absolutely be appropriate in these areas. But because of their unique infrastructure and transportation assets, these areas are really well suited to support some of the more heavy industries that are already located in Calumet and may continue to be in the future. These areas are also buffered from, surrounding neighborhoods, either by other properties of other kinds of use, right? We might have a step down from this heavy use category to a property that is moderate, and then on to the neighborhoods beyond, or maybe down into the commercial and light industrial, and then to the neighborhood beyond. But really, these are for the most part, these are areas that are really separated from the surrounding neighborhoods. They're areas where there are today a lot of these existing heavier uses. And so when I say heavier uses, what are we talking about? We're thinking about intensive manufacturing. So things like paint manufacturing, right? We've got Sherwin-Williams plant on the southern edge of the Pullman Industrial Corridor. That's an intensive kind of manufacturing. So this is an area where, again, separated from other uses. Um, Heavier freight and logistics, kind of freight terminals, a lot of movement of raw materials. Again, that's a heavier use that we want to limit to very specific areas that you see here, but it's a use that requires access to the river and access to rail. So the areas you see here really align with that. And then things like waste processing and recycling. Again, in many cases, those require access to kind of major infrastructure and transportation networks, whether that's the river, rail, or highway. But again, are best suited kind of furthest away from the neighborhoods. So again, prioritizing those places where river, rail, and highway exists, and where we can best buffer from surrounding neighborhoods. And if we go to the next slide, I will turn it back to Dara to talk about what comes next.
Thanks, Luke. And yeah, seeing some great questions in the chat. So please, or in the Q&A. So please continue to share your questions to us. So your feedback is critical to the planning process and the stage that we are in right now. We will be launching a survey shortly after the webinar, and we will send out an email to the participants and anyone who registered for the webinar to take our survey. Feedback from the community, like members yourselves, will help the project team refine the draft goals, visions, principles, and the land use framework itself. So over the next several weeks, we're going to be collecting this input via an online survey. If you registered, you'll get the email with the survey link. It'll also be available on our project website, which is Chicago.gov/Calumet. And we will do our best to circulate the survey link across, but you can also feel free to share it with your friends, your families, your colleagues. We will be taking those survey results, turning it into a summary of the feedback that we're getting from the survey, from our engagement events, and then applying that to our land use framework. So be on the lookout for that. We will also be in the community at a couple of events coming up in August. So we'll be at the August 16th Big Marsh Park Community Bike Ride, August 18th, the Back to School Fest at Gately Park Stadium, and then also the Back to School Jam at Pullman Community Center. These are not all the events that we're going to be at, but just a little taste of what we'll be at in August. And before we go into additional Q&A, so again, feel free to submit your questions in the chat. We'll be able to take one or two live. We wanted to also share a couple of questions that you might have or you might be thinking of as you're listening to this presentation. So the first one is, how is the community going to be involved in this process? So community engagement is the cornerstone of our planning process. Our approach prioritizes having equitable and inclusive engagement strategies, including space for open dialogue. So we'll see that a lot in our working group, feedback from community members, and local interest groups as well. So we do have large public events that allow for interested members of the community to share their thoughts and feedbacks in that specific event. And at the same time, we realize that that's not always going to capture all of the feedback, which is why we are launching the survey. We also use focus groups, one-on-one interviews, online and in-person surveys. Youth engagement is very important to us, and pop-up events and more. So we also have established a working group that I shared a little bit more about at the beginning of the webinar that has local elected officials, community organizations, industrial and non-industrial business owners, residents, civic organizations, city departments, and other governmental partners that meet monthly. And of course, like to use the additional engagement opportunities to capture the input and feedback from people who are not necessarily in our working group. Okay, so you might be wondering, how long will this planning process take? So we are anticipating taking the rest of 2025 and then extending into 2026. We have multiple phases that have been broken down for this land use framework, including analysis and understanding, which we conducted in summer of 2024, spring of 2025. If you'd like to see some of our work, that is also on our website. Then the land use framework and design guidelines concept development is what the phase that we are in now. So that started in spring of 2025 and will go through winter of 2025. And when it comes to the actual writing of the plan and adoption and all of those processes, that will be in winter 2025 and go through summer 2026, we anticipate. So throughout all of these phases, there's going to be opportunities like this one to provide public input to make sure that the plan reflects the community's needs and aspirations. So again, we encourage you to take the survey when we launch it so that we're able to capture your feedback. And how were these materials developed? So Luke had shared a little bit more about how the draft land use framework, the different principles, the vision, and the goals were developed. They were mainly developed by DPD with support from the consultant team, which included findings from our existing conditions analysis. So that is looking at what the current area is, how are they operating right now, what's working, what's not working, what the trends are, reviewing prior plans. So we looked at, gosh, I think maybe 20 plus plans that have been written in the area. So we looked at quite a bit of prior plans to make sure that we are capturing community interest and feedback and recommendations that have already been suggested. We've done some research into best practices, especially for the design guidelines. And we've also received a lot of feedback from some of our engagement to date that really helped shape the draft recommendations that we're sharing today. We had early input from small group discussions and participants, as well as monthly discussions with our working group. We've engaged different organizations across the city of Chicago as well, and have also, again, our working group has word offices, businesses, so we try to have a mix of both local organizations, residential organizations, industrial businesses, and then also citywide orgs as well. Okay. Now we're going to turn it over to respond to your questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and it'll be me and Luke. Let's take a look. It looks like we have a couple that have been answered as
Yeah, and
well.
I see some of those. It looks like the answer, they're marked as answered because we had a response. But yeah, I think we can jump in on some of these. So Peggy asks, has a projected impact of AI been taken into consideration when addressing the jobs related goal and how that will impact jobs locally and regionally? I'd say not explicitly at this stage have we gotten into that. I think, from our conversations with CAIC and industrial businesses in the area, we do know that automation is obviously it's been here for a bit, even prior to AI, quote unquote AI. We've had automation. I'll say that, you know, as far as the land use plan is concerned, we want to make sure that um, the land use plan sets the area up to support job-rich kinds of uses. Obviously, that landscape changes faster and faster as these new technologies are taken on. So um, I don't think we have a ton to say specific to the impact of AI, but I think as it relates to the land use plan, we want to make sure that we are supporting the kinds of industrial uses that continue to employ folks. Um, what else do we see here?
There's
Ah,
a
sorry, go ahead, Dara. Yeah,
No, that's
help
okay.
me.
Um, will the residents in these areas be impacted? For example, will the homes be destroyed to make way for projects?
So, short answer is no. Let me just say no at the top of this, and then let me give a kind of a longer answer here. So, there aren't we don't have any proposed projects as part of this planning study, right? We're not suggesting that specific developments occur on any specific property. The area we're looking at here is about 10,000 acres. It's about 4 times the size of downtown. So it's a huge area. And the scale of this plan is to really say, should areas redevelop in the future? What are the appropriate uses? Now, in terms of the question in particular, will residents be impacted? The study area that we're looking at is specifically industrially focused. There are very few residential properties within our study area. Many residential properties surrounding our study area, but very few within. The areas that are residential today within our study boundary, this plan anticipates remaining industrial over the next, or excuse me, remaining residential over the next 10 to 20 years. So existing residential that's within the study boundary would continue to be residential moving forward. And in fact, what this plan is looking to suggest is some areas where there's existing residential within our study boundary are very close to existing industrial uses. And it's really the industrial uses in many of those cases that are not appropriate long term, especially when we're talking outside of the existing industrial corridors, which are the specifically bounded areas on the map. So the the summary of that, the slightly longer answer to the question, there are no specific projects being proposed, but the areas that we see as appropriate for industrial or commercial uses long term are not the same as are currently residential in the study area.
Thanks, Luke. We have a few more questions coming in. So one question is, will the framework plan include a consolidation plan for infrastructure enhancements?
I don't know that I would um, frame it quite as a consolidation plan, but I think that's a fair way of putting it, John. I think the nature of a land use plan is such that we aren't going to get into a lot of very specific transportation proposals, but a lot of our partners, whether that's other departments here at the city, like CDOT, or transit agencies, or the county Department of Transportation, a lot of those agencies have already proposed potential transportation improvements. And as in the term consolidation plan, those improvements are kind of scattered across many different plans and proposals. So, yeah, part of what we'll be doing is collecting all of those that continue to make sense and that are really tied to the work that we're doing. And we would be proponents of those. There have been many trail improvement, bike lane improvement proposals. There have been proposals for rail and other transit improvements. So, we want to make sure we're reflecting that. Um, but again, transportation is not a major focus of the plan.
And then keeping on with that theme, there is some questions about transportation here specifically. So which comes first, roads or businesses? The highways can barely handle current traffic. Is there a plan for the redesign of Bishop Ford? And then there was another question about public transit improving within the plan. So maybe we can take the highway question first and then move into public transit, which I think you answered.
Yeah. So, highway design, how many lanes there are, any of that kind of stuff would really be taken on by Illinois Department of Transportation in coordination with the federal government. What I do know is that CDOT is working with IDOT to explore some potential changes to some of the off ramps and on ramps of the Bishop Ford. I think specifically along 111th. I hope I have that right. Um, but in terms of changes to the actual highways, that's just not really in the scope of what we're looking at here for this plan. And then similar with transit, we're coordinating with the transit agencies as part of this study. Because we are looking at the industrial areas, we're not really talking about potential population changes or anything like that. So I think for us, the way we're intersecting with transit is to make sure that we have um, the job centers that could be created or that exist today in this area should be served by transit. And the goal is to, I think, a broader goal for the city is to make sure that a variety of modes, travel modes, are supported. So we do want to be able to see folks who work at the companies in these corridors be able to take transit or other non-motorized transportation to their jobs. And we know that this area is really tricky to get across, even for folks that are just moving from one side of the far south side to the other. Even if you don't interact with any of the industrial businesses there, between the lake, the river, the rail lines, some of the strange platting in the area, it's hard to get across this area. Will specific transit improvements be recommended in this plan? I'll be honest, we probably won't get quite to that level, but I think we may be able to identify how the city and the transit agencies can work together in the future to make sure that investments can be made that really support the land use categories that the plan puts forward.
Great. And then we have one more question, one comment. So one question is, are there specifications for buffer zones? And maybe if you could de-jargon what buffer zones
Yeah,
mean and then answer the question, that would be great.
yeah. At this stage, in the current, where we are in the draft framework is we've just identified what these larger land use categories are, right? So those five categories. I mentioned that buffer uses would be kind of part of that open space and restoration category. So as we think of these land use categories, those are really assigned uh, to the properties themselves, right? So a property would fall under one of those five categories, and that's what those maps kind of showed. In those cases, where we have vacant vegetated properties today, um, that can serve as a buffer or a break, a barrier, a separator between industrial uses and non-industrial uses, we want to make sure that we find a way to formalize those, right? So there are today some properties in the Calumet area that are wooded, vacant properties that are doing a good job of separating industrial uses from non-industrial uses, but they're not formalized, right? Maybe they're zoned to be something else. Maybe they're owned by a private owner who's not really maintaining them. So one of the goals of the plan is to identify those, make sure that those have a path towards being formalized and can continue to serve that purpose. What I'll also say, though, is as we advance this plan over the next few months, we will be looking more broadly at the buffering concept, recognizing that in some cases, buffering would need to happen on part of a property, right? So maybe there's a large property that is totally appropriate for industrial use, but really needs some amount of the edge of that property to be vegetated in order to buffer the main use from its neighbors. The back half of our study here is going to be developing design guidelines. That's also an update. 2004 design guidelines were established for this area. We are looking to update those as part of this process. So those design guidelines would have more specifications, I think, as you put it, Peggy, around if you're developing an industrial property in an area that is appropriate for industrial, how wide of a buffer do you need to put on your property between you and your neighbor, between you and the street, a vegetated setback that would allow for your use to exist, but to be separated from adjacent uses. So that's a later part of this plan that we'll be diving into, but the buffering you saw on the screen today was really about entire properties that are suited to be those buffers today.
Great. And then we do have one or comment really about AI could create the need for data centers.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think a couple of things I'll say on that. Number one is just outside of our study area, the Illinois quantum development has been proposed and is in the process of being um, developed. That in and of itself, in addition to the kind of broader AI trend, uh, could see data centers be a potential use. I'll say there is a separate effort happening at the city right now to understand data centers, the impacts of those, where they're appropriate, where they're not, kind of at the citywide scale. I think for the purposes of what we're looking at, um, industrial areas maybe are appropriate locations for data centers. Um, so, to the point of maybe there will be more of those than there are today. Maybe there will be more of those than other uses. It's something we're thinking about, but we don't have any. I wouldn't say we have any specific notes on that at this moment.
Great. And then I can take this one. Will surveys regularly get sent out to send comments? So we do have this one planned survey right now. There is the potential for future surveying, but in addition to surveys, we will absolutely be conducting additional community engagement. So if you've signed up for this webinar, you will be getting notified of in-person as well as virtual events that could be happening in the future. So. Great. All right. And then can we incorporate other sustainable benefits in terms of landscaping and noise pollution?
Yeah, so that is very much going to be a goal of the updated design guidelines. So again, what you saw today is really that land use framework, what kinds of uses are appropriate broadly over the study area. The next phase of work that we'll be diving into is on a specific property, what are the requirements for landscaping? What are the requirements for stormwater management? What are the requirements for uh, air pollution or noise pollution or other kinds of mitigation strategies. So that's very much going to be part of this study. We're just not quite there yet, but yeah, definitely thinking in the right direction.
Great. And then we have, can we still submit written comments? Absolutely. So we are definitely in the please give us as much feedback as you can stage. We will be sending out the survey to everyone who is registered for this webinar or if you're on our mailing list here. And we encourage comments, especially at this stage. There is, of course, that public comment period after we release a plan, but of course, we want to get your input now so that we can incorporate that into the framework.
I'll just tack on to that to say if you do have thoughts, I'd ask uh, wait for the survey first if you could. That's just going to be a really good way for us to capture those thoughts. If there's something else you want to share that the survey did not really have a place for you to share that, by all means, you can reach out via email or any other way to give us that information. But I want to make sure that we get things in the survey format first and foremost, and then by all means, we want more if you've got more.
Great. All right. And then we have two more questions. So one is, can you give an example of large industries that we might anticipate?
Yeah, I mean, we can't speak specifically to, companies or really even to specific sectors at this stage. What I'll say is, um, there are a number of large vacant properties within the study boundary. Um, eh, Based on kind of how the five use categories we talked about today are mapping out, many of those would fall, not all, but many of those would fall in either the moderate industrial, the light industrial, or the heavy industrial uses. So, it really depends on which use category a particular property is located in. So in some cases, We may be talking about manufacturing, additional manufacturing, advanced manufacturing uses. In some cases, we might be talking more about um, other forms of industrial processing. In some cases, we might be talking about more commercial uses, right? Whether that's, I think I mentioned earlier, whether that's something that has a production element to it, like a brewery, furniture maker, or something that's more purely commercial, like a restaurant or shopping area. So, um, again, the goal of the plan is to make sure that the right kinds of uses are in the right location across the study boundary. Those are pretty broad categories, and so really anything within those categories, it has the potential to be located there, but that of course is dependent on a private property owner coming up with an idea for what they want on their property and then proposing it.
We have a question on what is the remediation strategy broadly?
Y- Yeah. Again, I would say we are not, there's no specific development proposal that we are really talking about with this plan. Remediation tends to happen property by property as a developer or development team kind of takes on that property and looks to develop something on it. What I can say is within our study boundary, we have three US EPA Superfund sites, many more than three brownfields, right? Former industrial sites that have some sort of contamination. Many of those are still operating today as industrial properties that just have contamination on them and would need to be remediated should they redevelop. But those Superfund sites are undergoing, a rigorous um, testing and planning process that is being led by the US EPA. Those are the Shroud site, which many of you may know, Avenue O, southwest corner of Avenue O and 126th, the former cluster site um, near Big Marsh, and then the Acme Steel Coke plant site on Torrance, just east of Big Marsh Park. And so those are sites that are the US EPA is tackling remediation plans for those. Other properties remediation would be the responsibility of the developing party.
Great. And then the last question for the webinar today is, can we agree on the use of the CMAP or We Will Chicago public participation plan? And yes, from our perspective, especially from the CMAP's public participation plan and We Will Chicago, that really set the stage for how we are conducting engagement throughout this planning process. In particular, establishing planning principles, integrating meaningful public participation through all of our activities, whether it is an in-person engagement event, small focus groups, one-on-one interviews, pop-ups. You'll see us at different festivals or just on the street corner, just getting feedback. So yes, we are very committed to robust public participation in this process, including this webinar and the survey that we'll be launching. Thank you for your question. Great. So that was the last question that we'll be taking today. Again, we'll be launching a survey, so that'll have a mix of both open-ended questions and also ranking questions as well. So we're able to get your raw feedback as you have it. Thank you all so much for attending the webinar today. We really appreciate your attention and your interest in this project as well. And we do encourage you to visit Chicago.gov/Calumet so you can stay up to date on our different resources, sign up on our mailing list, and be notified for additional engagement opportunities in the future, including a summary recap of this webinar. And the recording and slides will be posted in a few days following this webinar onto the website as well. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.